Hello and welcome to today's NSF webinar on the subject of data governance process. This is part of a series of free webinars from NSF and I'd invite you to join us for them. They're limited to 135 people for each event, so please do sign up and make sure you don't miss any of what's proving to be a very interesting series. I'm Rachel Carmichael and I've worked for NSF for over 3 years now. And prior to that, I was an inspector for nearly 11. I was an inspector in the UK, focused on good manufacturing practice. And throughout my time at the agency, I worked with a lot of companies who had difficulties with data integrity, even before we called it data integrity in that one umbrella. So we're talking here about good documentation practice, good document control, and computer systems validation. And throughout that time frame, all of these same events and problems were experienced, but we just called them by a slightly different name. I'm a biochemist and officially eligible to be a qualified person. I have a master's in industrial pharmaceutics, and rather more unusually, I have a master's in marketing. But today we're going to be talking about your data governance process. And the reason we've chosen to talk about this is because we've recently been to a number of companies that have had recent problems on their inspections. Now, the point is with these companies that 3 or 4 years ago, maybe more even, they have put in their policy and their procedure for data integrity. They've trained their personnel in what Alcoa stood for, and then they've probably looked at their chromatography process and made sure that that was to some degree under control. They will have looked at whether they had any pre-injections for their runs and also whether they were doing any manual integration. And some of them have put in a proper review back to the original data. But really, they considered it to be a laboratory problem. They didn't really want to explore much beyond that. The fact that this was going to be an issue was something that they weren't terribly open to, and they weren't particularly keen on hearing about the fact that they could have data integrity problems elsewhere across the company. Maybe they weren't as bad as a truly bad company could be, but perhaps the senior management were very, very busy. This wasn't something that they wanted to get into the detail of, and they weren't too keen and didn't have formal processes to ensure that problems from the shop floor were brought to their attention. In companies where they do know what the problems are and they take the responsibility for what's going on, that communication from the front line is encouraged and acted upon. In fact, sometimes we look at companies where it's been encouraged. They know what all the problems are, but they haven't done anything about it. And then these companies have experienced rather more recent inspections where things have been pointed out, like they've got inconsistent training, they haven't trained the new staff in that policy or procedure, it hasn't gone into the training curriculums. The staff in general might or might not know what Alcoa is. Let's face it, they've not really heard about it, except for sort of perhaps once a year in the last few years, maybe, if it was part of GMP refresher training. But when you start asking shop floor operators what does Alcoa stand for, it's not at the forefront of their mind. It's not something that they can just roll out. And then also, in some companies, they've really only thought about chromatography. They have not looked beyond chromatography systems, not even into the other systems within their own laboratory. So the data governance system requires you to have a much broader plan of attack. The senior management are there to ensure that adequate systems are in place and not to assume that they are. It all has to be fully documented within your quality system, and it's a really quite comprehensive approach. Now, the initial expectation was set from the MHRA's guidance, and in that, you've got to be in control of yourself. You've got to understand what your potential risks are, and these are risks from a patient perspective. So could it be that the product ends up not meeting the full specification, not just the finished product testing specification, but the specification of how you manufacture it, and therefore could be withdrawn or could be actually adverse for your patient. Now, this isn't an MHRA special. Data governance systems, looking at how all of your system operates to ensure the effectiveness of your controls, is in other guidance as well. It is referred to in WHO, the concept is there, and it's in the PICS guidance, which many global regulators are a party to. So this is the Pharmaceutical Inspectors Cooperation Scheme, and it's the core process by which inspectors around the world are trained to have that consistency of approach. And they've issued a latest draft of their document, which is available on their website for review now. So, looking at FDA, which is also a member of PICS, data governance officials and guidelines are mentioned in their Q&A. They don't put it out in quite the same way that other documents do, but as it's in the PICS guidance and FDA are part of PICS, there will be a general assumption that you have looked into this and understand what it is that you're trying to achieve. In this talk, as in so many, I'll go back to the structure that David Churchwood has shared in his presentations, in which he's clearly identified a four-pronged attack. Underpinning this is your culture, and your culture and how you actually are within your operation is one where we want it to be open and transparent. And the PICS process also recommends that we've got to achieve this open and transparent culture, and they would suggest within PICS that you use a code of values and ethics. And that sets out what it is you aspire to be, what it is you intend to be. And then you create an environment that will reflect that. But what do we mean by this? By open, it means that everybody can raise issues and they will be addressed, not dumped on the person that raised them. Well, what are you going to do about it? Response to big issues is not helpful. We need a process by which people can raise problems and collectively they'll get addressed. Transparent is slightly more tricky in some ways, but what we mean by this is that what you say you do and what you actually do is clearly documented and recorded so that you can see retrospectively what it was that was done. So, for example, if you have an isolator operation, you may use a scribe activity. And in a transparent operation, that would mean that the process is clearly described within the procedures. So we have 2 members of staff involved in each operation. One does the work in the isolator, the other makes the record of the activities as they are done. And the procedure would describe that both of them would sign in to the batch record for doing the work, and they would then ensure that the person doing the work in the isolator countersigns the record of the work as soon as he's finished, so that it's very clear that 2 people were involved. Both signatures will appear on the paperwork. Now, culture in general is a tricky subject, and I've previously conducted a webinar that looks at culture in more detail, specifically through the angle of ISPE's Cultural Excellence Report. And you might find it helpful to go and back and have a look at that webinar to get a general overview of the topic and how organisations build successful cultures. This is something that you have to work on continuously, and it doesn't enable you to slack off and to leave a subject for a year. You have to be on it every day, just as you have to with good documentation practice. It's a never-ending activity, really. But throughout all of this, your people and the culture are crucial, and the leadership is vital. You want to make sure that your training covers why and not just what. And there are building blocks within the cultural element that you might want to think about. So a code of practice that makes us look at our values and ethics. I could recommend looking at the PDA model. It's very comprehensive. There may be parts of it that you think maybe it's a bit too much for your site, but certainly it's a very helpful starting point. We've got to ensure accountability. We've got to make sure that our quality system is owned throughout the operation. So we've got job descriptions that detail all of the responsibilities, and we make sure that there's no gaps or overlaps within our operation. And each of those job descriptions need to include the responsibility for data integrity. Look at your recruitment process. We want to make sure that people we're recruiting are capable. Let's start from that first point. If they've got horrific handwriting and you can't read an application form, then you're going to have problems. And make people do a handwritten application form. Typing everything, unless you've got electronic batch records, is not going to be helpful for you. If you have electronic batch records and your staff never do any handwritten work, then fair enough. But for the vast majority of companies, we're still on paper for the batch records, and your staff need to be able to write in a legible manner. We're going to look at training and education, both at the point of induction and thereafter. I can remember going for my first good documentation practice training, sitting in a room with one of our supervisors from production. At that point, I hadn't even seen a batch record. This is when I worked at Eli Lilly, and Terry took me through the batch record, and I sat there thinking, well, you're all mad. I'm never going to be able to fill in a form that neatly and actually single line sign and date with an explanation. It's a bit much, isn't it? But it's not a bit much. It's how we will make sure that our activities are transparent. So through the training, we've got to make sure that we are demonstrating correct behaviours. We all stay involved with what's actually required and make sure we keep on top of what's going on from a regulatory perspective. As data integrity problems are found, the potential scale and scope of the issue widens. There's no simple way of approaching this to say, do this and you'll be fine. Because for the most part, we're dealing with the originality of people and ways in which they have found corners to get around. And in doing so, they're rather creative. And in being creative, you have to recognize that there's no hard and fast solution to this problem. We want to make sure we have a culture which is focused on no blame for honest errors and a speak-up culture that makes sure people feel comfortable in telling us what's going on. And I would recommend that regardless of whether you think you've got a good culture or not, have an anonymous system for reporting. It's important that that anonymous system is there so that if you've got local problems, localized problems, there is a way for the message to get out. Capacity planning needs to include the time that it takes to maintain your pharmaceutical quality system. Many capacity planning systems are based on the capacity of the equipment. But we've got to have realistic expectations. If you have 200 deviations a year, you need to resource your operation so that 200 investigations can be done a year. If you are not allocating the right resources to meet the expectations, you will find that people will find a way around it. And generally, that's not a good outcome. Finally, we've got to have management behaviours that make sure there's no reward for speed over quality. You've got to have fair and just consequences and rewards. If people are faster than the standard, it is unlikely that they are doing what you're expecting them to do. And giving them rewards or awards for being the most efficient is driving the wrong behaviours, because what we need is to make sure that we are meeting expectations of all elements of our operation. So that's the sort of elements to think about within setting up your structure for culture. And then the next section of David Churchwood's model is to understand your risks. Too often in pharma, we wait for something bad to happen to us. We write the deviation and we find the root cause, we address it, and we will put in a corrective action, which means we're trying to prevent it from reoccurring. This whole model is based on ICHQ9, where we are trying to find potential issues before they happen to us, put in a preventative action, and stop the event from occurring. And too often we don't really work this way in pharma. We are all about doing it, waiting for something to go wrong, sort it out afterwards. And that's not the way in which a modern pharma operation needs to be working. We need to look at our operations, understand them, and then consider how we're going to stop things from going wrong before they happen. So for your risk identification, obviously we've got to have some sort of procedure for how we're going to go about this. It has to be fully documented and reflected within your quality system, so you're probably looking at some sort of protocol and then a report. So your protocol will describe how you're going to go about doing your risk assessment and then the risk management that comes from it. Now, we often have been to companies where different teams have approached this in different ways. But ideally, you want to be having one model that the whole site can follow, and one model that enables a standardization of approach across the site. Your actions need to be captured. Hopefully, they'll go into your CAPA system. What you don't want is for them to be on a risk assessment document detailing all the things you need to do, and then it just to sit there and never be utilized. So we've got to have visibility of those actions, and hopefully you achieve that by using your standard CAPA process. So each department needs to identify and prioritize the activities based on their risk assessment. We're not going to go through how to do a risk assessment here today. It is one of those things where there's so many ways of doing it that you need to find your own process, your own method, one that suits you, that will identify the risk to patient and product. And what I would say is within each department, they need to think really carefully about where they have lone workers. So perhaps one person who's responsible for the entirety of a process. Calibration is typical in this respect. It's often one person that coordinates the program, coordinates the records, and we need to identify those areas where it is one person fully responsible for an activity. And we need to view that activity with a slightly higher risk than we would do otherwise. Because where we have one person or a limited group of people, possibly in an area with limited access, these are areas where the way around the process can easily be found, is harder to identify, and certainly in silo groups, so perhaps groups of 3 or 4, maybe 5 or 6, these are areas where it's been quite often seen that there's a degree of bullying occurring. So regardless of what your company policies and procedures say, the vast majority of staff will go along with how it is done in that space. So we need to look out for those and make sure we are aware that they could represent a higher risk. For each activity, you want to map the process. I met a gentleman recently who had been told to map his processes, and he genuinely couldn't see what benefit that was going to be from a data integrity perspective. And on its own, mapping your process is no benefit. What you need within this whole activity is to map the process, and then, as each step of the process, work out which records are created, be they paper, be they electronic, or a combination of the two, which is a hybrid record. Then you do your risk assessment of those documents. Can they be made to create records which are not complete, not consistent, not accurate, that don't meet the requirements of Alcoa, so you can't tell who did the work, you can't read them properly, there's a chance they weren't recorded at the time they were meant to have been recorded, they're not the first and only version of the record, and they may not tell the full story, they might not be accurate, they might not be the truth. So if you do that risk assessment, you identify those gaps and the weaknesses, you then need to prioritize the activities and mitigate that risk. Or if you're not going to mitigate it, you need to accept the residual risk, and you need to explain why you are accepting it. Now, I say that this is, no use just mapping your process. If you stop there, you'll achieve nothing from a data integrity point of view. All these other activities are what needs to occur to help you understand what needs to be managed from a risk perspective. So that's the second step. We're moving on now into the more directly governance perspective. And here we are looking at two aspects, the organisational and technical controls. And we want to address data ownership and accountability for those records throughout the lifespan. We need to make sure that we are fully aware of each type of record and who's responsible for it at which point in time. And that's throughout its life cycle. So from the point when you first put pen to paper or a computer system first captures the information, you're looking through that life cycle of when it gets reviewed, when it gets reported, perhaps you've got some processing in there, you might change the calculations. And throughout this process, from then ongoing to retention, to archiving, to pulling it back from the archive, we need to have owners at each stage. So these are organisational technical controls, are how you look at your mitigations, your actions perhaps, and the organisational ones are the procedures and systems that are in your quality system to support the process, and technical controls around going towards automation or doing computer systems validation. And at the governance level, we want to have a data integrity policy and procedure. We've got to have that risk register, understand what the risks are, be managing them actively. We've got to have that clear data ownership for all your records throughout the life cycle. And that's actually a fundamental part of GMP. It's nothing new. Each part of your system should be owned and understood along the stage. Your deviations procedure needs to address what you're going to do if issues are found for data integrity. So if you've got a data integrity problem, it needs to go into your deviation system. You cannot handle it informally outside of the quality system. And I've seen a number of companies recently, as a result of the ISPE Cultural Excellence Report, pushing towards Gemba, which is excellent. But remember that if you find data integrity problems during your Gemba walks, they need to go into the deviation system. You can't handle them casually outside of the system. So Gemba is not an excuse for not operating in line with your pharmaceutical quality system. Bear in mind, whatever you outsource needs to have the same requirements, and we want to make sure that we're monitoring our activities. We've got key performance indicators associated with our activities, so when things are not going as well as they ought to, we can readjust and focus where we need to. And then it's your management review process that needs to be looking at this, needs to understand whether we're in control or not, because it's their responsibility to ensure that the measures are effective. Okay. With regards to outsourcing, and we're saying that the requirements are the same there as they are within your own operation. As a contract giver, you need to ensure that certain elements are within your technical agreement, and that's that the data ownership, the governance of that data, and the accessibility of it are addressed. So what you don't want is to have any kind of difficulties when you come and do your audits, when you do your reviews as part of vendor assurance. You don't want difficulties in looking at the data and understanding what kind of problems there may be. If your contractor has a critical issue for data integrity, they need to be obliged to inform you. Okay. Now, that's kind of high-level governance, but the detail in this is all within the operational level of instructions. And getting into these elements is really where some people have started. And they've started with the policies and procedures, but they've not thought it through fully, and in doing so, they've kind of missed so many elements of what's necessary to pull this all together. If we're looking at the organisational elements, we've got to have some sort of data integrity policy or procedure, and your elements in here will have covered good documentation practice and good documentation control. And no free issue of forms is one of the hardest parts, as far as I can see, in all of this. Ultimately, on a computerized systems, it either meets the requirements or it doesn't. But getting people to really control all the bits of paper that they fill in is proving quite a challenge. On a risk basis, you can move over to logbooks. You can move over to a limited number of forms that are issued at one point in time and then accounted for. But if you look at a typical warehouse, they could have about 20 forms, and their forms are all about communicating with other parts of the factory. And so having a logbook of the forms doesn't really work because you can't move that on to the next department. And certainly enabling that communication from the warehouse to the rest of the operation without these forms is a challenge. So there's a need to understand how many issue of these forms are occurring, how many have been used, and then what is the gap. How many could have been recreated is really what you're looking for. It's a good documentation practice. You're going to cover paper records, electronic records, and hybrid records. So many procedures still only cover paper. Haven't really thought about what's necessary for electronic and for hybrid. So for hybrid, you need to be very clear on where you are determining your formal record to be, and bear in mind that in most cases it needs to be that original, so the format in which it was originally created, because what you can't bring with you is all of the metadata. And so in the absence of all of the metadata, you really need to be looking at your original. The printout is unlikely to be a true reflection of that, full reflection of that. We've got to think about our record retention policy, and then also within the procedures and system design is how are you addressing your computer systems validation. Sometimes that's within your site validation master plan, sometimes it's within individual procedures. The next stage is your data checking. So yes, you're going to have some batch-to-batch type of review. You're going to be looking back at the original data where you need to. Certainly for all of your quality control tests and your in-process quality control tests, and probably anything you've identified as critical within your submission for your process. And anything that is key and could be viewed from different perspectives needs to be part of your original data review. Then you've got to have a non-routine review, probably by quality assurance, sometimes by IT, where you're looking at your systems that you know are weak and look for any evidence of inappropriate behaviour. Now, you will do that more frequently on systems that your risk assessment has identified could be a problem, and then less frequently on those that you think are probably all right based on your documented risk assessment, because your rationale will justify the action that you're taking. So system surveillance, now this is more formal. You've got to make sure that your auditors have been trained into what to look for the data integrity, that they have included it within the scope of both internal and external audits. So when they are looking at their contractors, be they a contract testing laboratory, a contract manufacturing site, or an organisation which does your internal calibration. So they could equally be identified as a critical supplier and have a full on-site audit. You need to look at their document control processes. Now, I would also consider introducing Gemba. We've recently looked at a company where they didn't just want their internal auditors trained in what to look for. They wanted all of their middle management to understand what it was that we were talking about. So they did a massive training for all of their middle management staff, and just make sure that when they find issues, they go into your quality system. As I said before, we've got to make sure they get documented within your formal quality system. Now, the final part of this model from David is looking at the automation and the computerized systems control, these technical controls that we will look at. Automation, first of all, is you've got high-risk activities that could be automated, that it is possible, that it's appropriate, then do so. Now, that's going to be, I would imagine, quite few and far between. And so for the most part, we're looking here at things that are truly critical and where the risk of human error has a potentially direct impact to patient. But we do use computerized systems in many other parts of our operation, and we've got to make sure we actually understand what systems we've got. So from the swipe system for getting into our facility to the Honeywell systems that manage our systems that manage our temperature and humidity within our factory. Lots of people say, well, we look at the output, we don't look at the control system. You need to look at the control system. We need to know that only people who are currently working here have access to be able to get into this system. And then beyond that, we're looking at ownership for each of those systems, and within the control of them, there are certain critical points that we need to think about. We want unique logons at the individual level. We want audit trails that create, modify, delete, and where the system is incapable of doing that, you should have paper systems to mitigate if the system is critical. We want to have clear segregation of duties so that the data administrators have no interest in the data. Now, you might have an administrator who will grant access to somebody or remove somebody's access. They might decide if you can be, having full access to the system or any partial access to the system. That's slightly different than being the data administrator who can create, modify, and delete. And there could be a case for having different people involved for those administrative tasks. Must make sure we get the minimum access to enable a task to be done. You cannot make everybody super users. And then the other element to really seriously think about is validation of Excel spreadsheets, requirements for which have never really changed. So that's the overall picture for data governance. When you look at it as a whole, it's an awful lot to do, but many people have been on this path for a long time now and have many elements addressed, but haven't necessarily thought about it as a whole. You could perhaps just do a gap assessment against the whole and then work out where you could just beef up your system a bit. But what you don't want is to have done so much work and then to be caught out for one or two smaller aspects of this overall approach. Well, I'd like to thank you very much for joining me today. If you have any questions, please do email them to us to farmermail@nsf.org. We are planning to do data integrity e-learning later in the year, but in the interim, there's a lot of e-learning up now, and you may well find that to be beneficial for you and your team. And in terms of free resources, the resource library is there and has a lot of the white papers and detail behind many elements of our training and of our auditing and consultancy activities. So thank you very much, and I wish you a very good rest of the day.